This is the Kingdom Movement Podcast, a place where we will explore, through conversation, how discipleship, theology, and community really can transform our world. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are your blessings when I don't even have a son, since you've given me no children? Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. So that was Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. And it's basically the starting promise of a man named Abram, that God had made this promise to him that he was going to give descendants that would be as numerous as the stars, right? And this is kind of where we left off in the story. And basically that God was going to call this person Abram. But we're going to back up a little bit. But before we do that, we do want to make some quick apologies. Last week, or in our last podcast, we got the stories of the Tower of Babel and Noah mixed up in chronological order. So if you read your Bible and you go, that's not in line with what they were talking about on the podcast, the same principles apply, but we accidentally flipped the story. I promise we prepare. It's just an oversight. And then the second apology is I'm suffering with a little bit of congestion during this recording, and so you'll have to bear with me if I sound obnoxious. I'm going to try and not clear my throat very much. But yeah, with that aside, I'm going to hand it over to Paulo to maybe kind of give us a summary of what we talked about last week and then where we're starting off today.
Yes. Thank you, Jake. I hope I don't get whatever you're having.
We're 6 feet. No.
Oh, yeah. Jokes aside. So yeah, last week we were just going through the story of creation, and we started with this idea of love dance in the sense of the idea of Trinity, is this idea of God dividing himself into these three and then practicing love. And through that, the Father loving the Son through the Holy Spirit. And then with that idea, it brings the idea of the creation. And then it makes this beautiful place in 7 days. And then it places this garden in the middle of this place. And then it makes him a man. And he gives him the authority to reign and everything. But then from there, we just see things going other way, man deciding to do things in his own way. And then from there, we see God trying to restore the humanity, trying to restore the world to the idea, to the same intentions in the Genesis one.
No, that's great. And I think as well, just to keep people in mind, where the story is. We've kind of gone through this whole narrative, and like you've mentioned, there's darkness, there's sadness, but now all of a sudden, strangely enough, it picks up, and there's this man. Mm-hmm. It kind of fast forwards. It doesn't give us very many details, but all of a sudden it just says, here's this family, right? Mm-hmm. I think it even gives a list of descendants, and then it starts with this family, and God begins to speak to them.
Yes, exactly. So we have when we read the Bible, we have to always remember the promise that God makes in Genesis 3 after the fall. He says there will come this guy who will be descendant of the woman, and then he will strike the snake, and it will crush the snake's head, and then snakes will bite, so this serves as a hope, so how will that happen, and I just feel like it connects straight to this man, who is there, this man who the Bible doesn't say a lot of things about him, just talks about his mother, him living and his mother and everything. But then God just called this man, and then he makes this promise: I will bless your nation, I will make your seed really, really big, and I will make your name, very famous, which is strictly direct to what was happening in the story before that, which is the story of Babel, which is this tower of people who are trying to make their own name, stand out,
Yep.
So the story is God calling, like, hey, I will make your name. So it's God making this guy's name, not himself, not him trying to make his name big.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think that follows the theme that we kind of talked about in last episode, is that God's intention is to work with humanity, but oftentimes he has to work against humanity to bring about his purposes. So we get this guy named Abram, later to be Abraham, as most of us know him, or in Portuguese, Abraham. And so the story picks up. There's a man named Terah who is Abraham's father, and he moves to a land out of a city called Ur. Ur at the time was a part of the Sumerian kingdom, Mesopotamia. For the average Joe, that doesn't really matter. For the Bible nerds like me, I like that type of stuff. But Sumeria in general, and Ur specifically, was one of the biggest urban centers of that time. It was the city. They say, archaeologists, one of the first actual legitimate cities. And so Abraham is a metropolitan man. He's not of his day, obviously. He's not like some country bumpkin by any means, as they would think of it. And so you have this urbanite person moving, their whole family moving, and God is calling them, but they stop, right? They don't get all the way to Canaan where God is calling them. And eventually his father Terah dies. And so, the biblical narrative isn't specific on if God was calling Terah, but we just know that he didn't go all the way, right? He didn't get to Canaan. But God, this God named, eventually we'll know as Yahweh, begins to speak to this man, Abram, and he says, I'm calling you to go. I'm calling you to leave the comfort of everything you know, and I'm calling you to go to Canaan. And at this point, most biblical scholars of the Old Testament believe that Abraham was probably a polytheist. He believed in multiple gods. He believed in the gods of his homeland. But somehow, some way, this specific God, this Yahweh, has spoken to Abraham in a way that is convincing and convicting enough to leave everything that he knows to be obedient, right? And we don't get all those details, right, of why or how he's convinced, but he says, okay. And I think that's important for us to understand that God, at this point in history, a lot has happened. Thousands of years have gone by. And so, Abraham is getting revelation of who God is little by little. So it starts off with just kind of like okay, whoever this God is, I guess I'm going to step out and trust him, to the point where, as we'll see later on in the narrative, Abraham really has given his everything to this God and has recognized that this is really the only true God to follow. But in the story, Abraham packs up, he takes his nephew Lot with him, and they go to what later will be called the Promised Land. And from there, I'm going to hand it off to you, maybe of what maybe some of that happens. Maybe explain the whole situation with Lot, a guy named Melchizedek, and then you can even take us up to maybe Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah?
Okay. Oh, that's...
I'm giving you a lot. Eh?
Yeah, I feel like. But, so yeah, God calls this guy, and as you were saying, and they go to this, they move out, and him and his cousin, but then it gets to this point where they can't be together, because remember, God just called Abraham, and then he just decided to take this guy with him, So you get to this point where they can't be together, and I just feel like you were more like name places name and more like into that.
Yeah.
I am into the big picture, but you kind of dive a little bit deeper into the particular parts of it.
I think basically what happens, I honestly, I would have to have it open in front of me, but they get there, right? And Lot and Abraham recognize, okay, our fields aren't going to work out. I think their shepherds get in an argument over a specific well. And Abraham, being the gentleman that he is, says, "Okay, Lot, you can pick whatever side of this valley that you want." And of course, he picks the nice one, and Abraham gets the not as nice one. But again, God promises him, "I'm going to take care of you," right? So then we get into Lot essentially gets captured by one of the local warlords or bandits or whatever, and Moses mounts a rescue. He kills all these dudes, gets his nephew back, and basically these other kings that were having an issue come to him, and Moses says, "No, I'm not going to share any of this stuff with you," because, like, he recognized the political situation. These people were trying to get political ties or hooks into him. And he says, really, this is the Lord's, right? I'm not going to get into bed with these guys, basically. And then, strange, we get this story about a guy named Melchizedek, which is where he is Salem, will later become Jerusalem, but it's not Jerusalem at the moment. And he is a priest king. We don't know really very much about him. The author of Hebrews takes this idea up because Abraham basically becomes a subordinate and receives blessing from him as a recognition of Yahweh, right? So then the story kind of fast forwards, and then we get to this point where we just read at the very beginning, this verse in Genesis where God is giving a promise. And essentially what God does is he says, "I'm going to do this for you." And then later he comes to Abraham and he says, "See that I want you to cut up a 3-year-old heifer or calf." So Abraham does it, and it's like this really weird thing. It gets dark, and there's this flaming pot that passes between the different pieces. And if you don't know the culture, you're like, what is happening here, right? Like, what is the point of all this? But what that ritual was whoever, if there was a covenant to be made, normally both parties would pass through the bull, and it would be a symbol of, what if I break my covenant with you, let what has happened to this heifer or this calf happen to me. So basically, let me be chopped up into pieces and killed. But God puts Abraham to sleep and passes through himself and basically fulfills both ends of the covenant. And he says, if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, I will be cut up in half, right? So God is making this extreme promise, putting himself almost in the role of a subordinate to Abraham, that if I break my promises, let this be done to me. And so, obviously Abraham, I'm sure for him that was quite the revelation of who this God was. And so he moves forward with these promises of having a son, right? So, sorry, I kind of hijacked what I asked you to.
No.
But we get to this point then where it's, he's promised children, right? And it's still not happening, or at least in his own timing. So Abraham does what most of us do. We bypassed a lot. There's a part where he goes to Egypt and lies to Pharaoh and says, this is my sister instead of his wife, blah, blah, blah. But we're trying to expedite this a little bit because we have a lot to cover. But basically, we get to this point where Abraham wants a kid, right? Like, how are these promises? Like he said in this verse, God, you haven't given me a kid, so how are you supposed to fulfill these promises? So he does what a lot of us do, and what this whole biblical story has been saying up to this point, which is, man trying to bring about God's purposes by their own means. And so maybe you can tell us what happens next.
Oh, yes. So Abraham and his wife, they can't have kid, and then it just like, oh man, I'm getting older and older, and then the wife, he's like, oh well, this guy needs to have a son, to just continue with the promise that God made to this man. So what happened is they take God's promise, the promise that God made to their life, and they say like, okay, we can try to help God,
That's a great way of saying it. We can try and help God with what He's trying to do.
So if it's not working with us, we can maybe bring someone else, who can fulfill this promise, So in that, Abraham's wives, makes him sleep with the slave, and then they have this son, which was gonna start a really big conflict, and then it's gonna end not in a good way, at least for the other family, but God become faithful in first he humbles him, and just making him realize like this son, it's not a property, it's not something that is yours, but if I ask you to give it to me, you'll have to be able to open yourself and be humble enough to do that.
Yeah. And I think with Ishmael, which is the son that's born from the maidservant, I'm blanking on her name right now. Do you remember the name? Ishmael's mom. You can look it up if you want.
Yeah.
But anyways, what I find super fascinating about this is God basically tells Abraham, he says, this isn't the child of my promises. So there are certain things that I'm going to accomplish. I gave you these promises, Abraham. And this child, Ishmael, is not the child that these promises will be fulfilled from. Because, we can kind of look at that and be like, well, that's kind of cruel. But the reality is that Ishmael was born from man's attempt to do what God was asking Abraham to trust him in. So it wasn't an act of trust, it was an act of, in a sense, disobedience. But God, in his mercy, takes disobedience and promises that he will still bless Ishmael, right? He won't be the promised child, but Abraham is not to mistreat him. And Sarah, at this point, is mistreating the servant. And I think that's another really important point, is that when we look at our own lives, just like, these are real people, right? Real family drama, that they thought, oh, this will be a creative solution to our God problem, if you will. But in reality, by taking it into their own hands, they created more issues for themselves. Sarah became jealous. She mistreated the servant, which in turn turns Ishmael into someone who's an adversary to his brother. And so you get this whole family drama that is not God's fault by any means. It's born from a lack of trust that God can provide, which is, again, the whole theme and thread that's been happening. Did you find that?
Oh, yeah, it's Hagar.
Hagar, yes. Yeah. So eventually Abraham is told, you know what, it's not going to work. Sarah's not, willing to have Hagar, especially now that they're... So, sorry, yes. We're skipping ahead and then we'll come back. But Isaac is the promised child. He is born. God does provide this baby miraculously through Sarah, who's old. But Hagar, son, Ishmael and Isaac are just not getting along. Sarah's not treating Hagar well. And so God sends them out. Yeah. And at one point, Hagar is in the desert and just puts Ishmael out to die, basically, because, they're out of food. They've been traveling. But God provides a spring for them, and he says, I will take care of you. Your son's going to be a wild man, but, I am going to provide for your family. You're still going to be numerous. So God, even in the mistake, takes care of this family. What's super interesting, just a short side note, is the whole Islamic faith takes credit from the line of Ishmael. And in a way, Islam is kind of in our belief and understanding, a parody of Christianity in a way, right? Because it has many, many of the same claims, but there are very nuanced differences that make all the difference. And in a way, it is a belief that we would say is born from, not a trust in God. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. If you look down the genealogies, now obviously someone who follows the faith of Islam would say something different, and they do claim that actually Ishmael was the person that God had chosen. You know what I'm saying? So anyways, that's a side note. But getting back to the main narrative, so basically God appears to Abraham again before Isaac is born in the form of kind of like this stranger with two angels. And he meets him at his tent. Abraham is hospitable to him, and Sarah's kind of behind the scenes. And God says, you're going to have a son next year at this time. And Sarah kind of laughs, and God goes, why are you laughing, Sarah? And she goes, I'm not laughing, but it's a realistic human moment, right? I feel like when you read the Bible for what it really is, these people are human beings that, see what God is telling them and think this is ludicrous, right? But basically, God has another mission in mind, which is another side plot in this narrative, and it's what's going on in two cities called Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's down in this valley, in the Jordan River Valley, if you're into geography. And at this point, the angels go down, and they basically want to rescue Lot and his family, because God is going to bring destruction to these towns because of all the horrible, awful things that they're doing. And so God does it. God rescues Lot. But his wife turns around, turned a pillar of salt.
Just to comment, that story used to scare me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Like, I would read that, I was like, Oh my God! Like if I was just trying to put myself in his wife's position, I would look back. I was like, I'm too curious to look back.
Yeah.
So I'm like, would God still, kill me or become this statue? So I would be really scared about this story. But yeah,
For
please
sure.
go.
So, anyways, Lot's daughters sleep with him in a cave. Really weird story. They're afraid, they're not going to be able to carry on the family name. And I'm honestly blanking on why the Bible feels like it needs to tell us that, but it does tell us that. But I think it's just the human drama of how broken humanity's situation is still, right? But I think up until this point, now God reaffirms those promises. The verse that we just read actually is at this point, at the beginning. And God is basically calling this man Abraham, right? And this is hopefully give us a little bit more focus with the story of Abraham. But God's solution to what is going on is that he is going to work through a human being, and more specifically a human family, to bring about his redemption and reconciliation to the world. And now it's kind of a very murky picture when we first see the story of Abraham, but as the story develops, you realize what God is doing. He's calling a specific people, not because they are special, not because Abraham is, by any means like morally superior to the rest of humanity.
I feel like the Bible just shows us how bad this guy is too. With just like, this guy, this woman that I have, even though God promised me to have a family with him, but I'm afraid I don't want to die, so I'm just gonna say she's my sister, and I'm just gonna give her to this king, who wants to marry her. And I feel like what you were saying about the story of
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes, I feel like it just brings that thing of just God wanting to partner with humans, because God goes to him and then he tells him, I want to destroy this place, but then God open up a space for Abraham to come, and kind of like we see, and we will see this along the story, just kind of human being coming and kind of changing God's mind, So I just feel like
maybe explain that story a bit more, because I totally skipped over that, but I think it's really important.
Yeah. So what happened is God says, he would just want to destroy this place, and so they start this conversation, Abraham and God, and Abraham says, oh God, if there is this number of people, and will you still destroy this number of people who are faithful? Will you still destroy the city? And then God said, no. If I send people, then and they find the number of people, I won't destroy the city. And then Abraham was like, I'm sorry, God, but if he slowly start reducing the amount of people to get to where I feel like he had a goal, which is I know how many, I know who's there, law and his family, So he wanted to get to that number, So he slowly gets down, And then God says, like, if I found this amount of people, I will not destroy, So we just find this kind of change of mind, that Abraham coming and kind of influencing God and everything, And then God end up like taking these people, because his plan was just to destroy. It's they're faithful or not, it's just to destroy, But you just see Abraham as coming as this partner with God, like, and he kind of influences God's mind.
No, I think that is a super good point. I'm glad you brought it up and we didn't skip over it, because it really is that God invites Abraham into the conversation, almost like as if he knows what Abraham's going to do. But so we kind of think like, well, God, why didn't you just do that from the beginning? But again, it is another kind of proof that God always wants to operate alongside human beings. That's how he wants to do things. And it is us that frustrate that purpose or that plan. It is not God who chooses to not use us. God is, in fact, looking for ways to invite us into the conversation, because that's the kind of God he is. And I think taking the framework of what we kind of painted in the episode 1 of this series, is it's because of love, right? That God wants to involve us because of love. And so God gives Abraham a son, right? This promised child, Isaac, is born to him. The promises seem like they're going to get fulfilled. This is where circumcision comes in. So God says this is kind of the covenant mark. So you're going to permanently mark your body and all your descendants basically saying it's not like circumcision wasn't done in other people groups or cultures of the time, but God is saying this is the physical mark of your family that you are now making a covenant, a promise with me, right? Just like maybe some of you get your spouse's name tattooed on your arm. It's like a permanent reminder of that person, right? And so that's kind of what God's doing here. But then the story kind of takes a really interesting twist. At this point, you're like, okay, things are moving along. The promises are being fulfilled after so long. But then God does something very strange, and he tells God tells Abraham to take Isaac to this mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. And you're like, what is happening here? This sounds like some weird pagan stuff. Like, what is God up to in this story? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And for me, like, one interesting thing is, like, you see, if you keep reading Bible, you see God as this person who really against child sacrifice and everything, But then he just called him to do this, And I just feel like this story just kind of has this test, just remember the Old Testament, and the tree, and just kind of serve this test, first to humble this guy, to make these guys, just humble, to know, like, if you really want this to happen, I am the one who gave you this child, so you will really need to trust my plans. You really need to be able to trust what I'm telling, or I'm saying it's gonna happen, And then just this act, is just God giving him opportunity to choose to really trust God, and he passes the test. He takes Isaac, and then goes to this mountain, and then it was just when he was close to just stab his son, and then God's provide for him.
And I think something that's really important in this narrative that we kind of touched on before is that Abraham prior didn't always trust God to bring about the purposes. And so in one way, I think for Abraham specifically, it's a reminder in the sense of, like, do you really trust that I can fulfill my promises to you? And we may think that's sadistic, we may not like that. I think we also have to understand that this is in the cultural context of that world, you know what I mean? And so there are understandings, there's cultural nuances that are happening there that, I'm not going to claim to be an expert, but to Abraham, it may not feel as foreign and as strange to him as it does to us today. And I know a lot of biblical scholars say you can't just draw a direct line to this, but I really do believe if the Bible is one continuous narrative, which is what we're basically having this series for, is to explain it is, I can't help but see the parallels in what God is planning to do with his only son, right? Because he literally says, you are willing to give me your one and only son. And what does the biblical authors in the New Testament pick up? Jesus as God's only son. And so I think they are, when they're talking about Jesus and his sacrifice, they have this story in mind that with Abraham, God is asking Abraham to do something that he is going to do himself. But at the very last moment, when it would cost Abraham everything, God says, no, I'm going to provide the sacrifice for you. And for Abraham, it was a ram. But in the New Testament, we see that he is actually giving up his son as a sacrifice to continue, not just continue, but to restore the promise, right? And so I think we have to, we filter everything in the Old Testament ultimately through the lens of Jesus, right? And so this story always would choke me up when I would read it, because it's like, I see what God is doing with Abraham thousands of years before he ever does, before Jesus is ever on the scene. But you can't help but read the parallels in the story. You know what I mean? So obviously, that's got to be a little bit of a traumatic experience for Isaac's childhood. But fast forwarding through the story, Isaac is a grown man. Abraham has passed away, or right before Abraham passed away, he makes one of his servants promise that he will get a wife, not from Canaan, but from his family back home, where they were living before. And so he sends out a servant. The servant goes, and he goes to Laban. I believe it's Sarah's brother? And so he goes there, and you want to...
I really want you to take take that story because I really want to take the Jacob story.
Okay.
I just love his story.
Hey, that's my name though, bro. I'm just. So, anyways, I do think there's one. So basically, Abraham's servant goes. He prays to God and he says, the next person, if she's the one, like she's gonna take care of my camels and everything else that I brought. And sure enough, this girl comes. She takes care of the camels. She does all this stuff. Rebecca is her name, and she does all these great things. And he's like, goes to the family. He says, you know what? Sarah and Abraham have sent me to basically find a wife for their son, and he wants them to go. There's kind of a little debate with the family. Laban is a little bit hesitant. He kind of tries to keep the guy around a little bit more, but finally they have assurances. She goes back, and her and Isaac are pretty much, they get along. It seems like a good fit, and it's just interesting because Isaac's story, compared to Abraham, the people he's sandwiched between Abraham and Jacob, is really not giving us a lot of details. There's not a whole lot about him. One of the funny things, though, that as I was kind of just reviewing before we did this podcast, was he does the exact same thing that his dad does. He goes to Abimelech, same guy, or at least the son of the same guy as Abraham, and he tells him, oh no, Rebecca's my sister, not my wife, and it's just funny because we talk about like family problems or generational curses or whatever, and you can see in the Abraham family this line all the way up to Jacob and beyond of like this kind of like this tricky deceitfulness in this family, like father like son. And so basically that's where kind of Isaac's story as the main character ends, and then it transitions into him and Rebecca have two sons, Jacob and Esau, right? And I'll let you take over, but basically when they're born, Jacob is born second, but he is promised to be the child of the promise. And I think that is a theme that happens throughout this, that normally the firstborn is the promised one, but God takes the narrative of the firstborn, who usually is the power broker of the family, and God flips it on its head, which is another theme throughout the Bible, is God takes what is typically traditional or ordinary and he flips it on his head to reveal something greater. Or he likes to take weakness and use it for his glory. So anyways, Jacob and Esau are born. You take it, my man.
So funny thing is, because when I think about, since I grew up reading the Bible, so when I think about names in the Bible, I think in Portuguese.
Okay, yeah.
So when you said Jacob is my name, I was like, is your name? And I was like, oh yes, in English it's Jacob, but in Portuguese it's Jacob. So I was like,
okay,
Jacob,
yeah.
just like a different name. So just
too funny.
Yeah, just funny thing. But yeah, I just like the way you started. I feel like if the Bible says even before they were born, Jacob is the one God tells Rebecca that he will be the one who will carry God's promise. So even before he was born, he's this guy who will take care of God's promise. But then you see this guy, they're born, they're twins, and then you just see like, oh my God, my brother is gonna take over. He's gonna rule. He's gonna be the king. He's gonna be the ruler, and he's gonna take care of. Not the king, but he's gonna continue with God's promise. And
so Esau is kind of the macho man, the typical one that you would think would rule, and Jacob's kind of a mama's boy.
Exactly.
So it's kind of set up already even to be that way.
Yes. Jacob is it's portrayed as this spoiled kid, who's just there, and there's this story where. Jacob is just sitting at home, just cooking and doing things, while Esau he goes out and then he starts hunting, and then he's busy, with all these things, and then he comes back home. He's tired. He was working. He was, taking care of like serious business, while this guy was just sitting home playing PlayStation, and everything. So he comes back and then he's hungry. And then he finds his brother sitting, doing his things. And then he say, hey, I'm really hungry, And then Jacob sees this as an opportunity, to kind of steal the right, of the firstborn from his brother. It's just like, if you don't want to die, if you really want my
Which is
food,
being a bit dramatic, right?
Exactly. If you want my food, and then you will sell me, your right of your right, of being the firstborn. And I feel like that's the Bible just shows that this is a really bad guy. And I really wanted to tell this story because I grew up in a church, and I grew up going to a Sunday school.
Yeah.
And people would tell us this story as if like Jacob is this really nice guy, this really
He's not
guy.
though.
Yes.
He's not.
But when I grew up and I went back to this story, and I was like, man, no. This guy is one of the worst, character in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yes, we have really bad guys. I feel like this is one of the worst person that God used. Other than the book of Judges, we'll get there. But so so he steals the right, but then that's not enough, And then it comes to the time where God wants to bless, the father Isaac wants to bless the firstborn, and Jacob and his mother, they have this plot, stealing the blessing from Esau, Esau is I don't know.
I think he's out hunting or something. Yeah, he goes. His father wants him to cook his favorite meal, so he says, "All right, I'll go out and get it for you."
Exactly.
So he's doing a nice thing for his dad.
Exactly, he's doing what his dad told him to do. But the mother's like, "No, we'll just plot here," and then the mother cooks. He can't even cook the meal. His
mom cooks it for him.
So the mother cooks for him, and then they steal the right. And then the brother comes back, and then he's just really, really mad.
Yeah.
And then Jacob has to run, and then he just run, and then he goes to this place, where he meets this really pretty girl.
Well, I think hold on before we get there. On the run, he basically gets to a place that later will be called Bethel, and he has a vision, right? And at this point. In the narrative, it's not very clear that Jacob even respects or has any sort of admiration for the God of his fathers who have gone before. So Abraham and Isaac. He even says so he gets this vision of angels descending up and down this ladder, and he says, surely God was in this place. But even at this point, in the narrative, the way that he talks is the God of my father. So God is not the God of his life at this point. It's more the God of Abraham and Isaac. Yeah, they trusted you, but kind of like the greasy trickster he is.
I've heard stories about you.
But it's more like, okay, once you show me that you're valuable to me, then maybe we can make a deal. And this is kind of the person that Jacob is, right? But so after that moment, he flees and he goes, and his mother advised him to go back to Laban, where she's from. So he flees and goes there. So go ahead.
Yeah. So then he flees. He finds this guy. He finds this girl. This really pretty girl. And I just feel like he's a trickster and all these things. So he meets. In that culture, if you want to marry someone, you have to start with the older person. The older daughter, has to be the one who's married and everything. But then he meets kind of the middle child, from this family, and he wants to marry it, And I just feel like this is a very ironic story because we have this trickster, this cheater, and all the things, and then he just meets a bigger, trickster, a bigger cheater, which is Laban. I don't know how you say in English. Laban, he's
Laban.
Laban, you know. So he meets this guy, who's way experienced with tricking people, So he tricked him into marrying his older daughter, and then he gets to marry the one he was supposed to marry, in this long time, he just becomes kind of a slave, to him. Even though, and I just feel like that comes the promise, God promised him, I will bless you, I will multiply,
and let me, I want you to keep going. I just wanted to look up, kind of follow in the Bible with you. And it is crazy. I didn't realize that Jacob's ladder is when he gives all the promises of Abraham and Isaac to Jacob. So this is when the Lord reveals it to him. And get this is what his response is. He says, if God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will certainly be my God. It's like, how much more of a punk do you have to be? God just gives you all these promises. You said, okay, if you take care of me, then. But anyways,
And here's the thing. Here's the funny thing. And I'm jumping a little bit more thing. And then he will still fight with God, It's just he'll still wrestle God, please bless me, right before he was not born, he had this promise, and then
Yeah.
he steals the promise, he steals the promise with exchanging food, and then his mother steals the blessing,
Yeah.
and then God's promising meets him, and then God's promising, but then he's still like, oh no, God,
Yeah.
bless me, please bless me if you're really God and everything. So yeah, I just feel like this is the story that it's portrayed of this really bad guy that sometimes we teach
Yeah, it's
him as some good hero in the Bible.
and as we'll see, the name Israel is the name that God gives Jacob. So this is the guy, like when you say Israel, I mean, this is the name of the people of God. And this is who they're named after, right? So it's so funny, but it's so, I feel like in a way, relieving that God is not afraid
Yes.
or unashamed to be with people that are the descendant of this guy. You know what I'm saying?
And I feel like the book of Genesis has a really, really amazing end, because I just feel like it ends with David giving this really amazing speech, and I just feel we'll get there and then we will read this,
You mean
and
Moses? Or not Moses.
Joseph,
Yeah, okay.
He gives this amazing speech,
Yeah.
to his brothers, and then he just kind of summarizes, what happens
Yeah.
in the whole book, these broken people, but then God uses these people, for the good.
For sure. So, okay, we left off. Have we got to the point where they've been married yet? Where the marriage drama comes into the story?
No, you want to take...
Yeah, that's fine. So, yeah, basically, Jacob's been working for 7 years. Laban says, yeah, I'll give you the younger, prettier daughter. That's the one that you want to marry. But Laban, following the family DNA, tricks Jacob into marrying the older daughter.
Yeah.
Now, Jacob probably had quite a bit to drink. It was dark. She would have been wearing a veil at the wedding. So it's not like he's just a fool of some sort that can't tell two women apart. But after they seal the deal in marriage, he wakes up the next morning. He goes, what in the world? This is not the girl I signed up for.
Yeah.
Laban basically says, well, it's not our custom to give the younger before the older. Jacob's ticked, but he says, you know what? Okay, I'll work for another 7 years in order to get Rachel. Now, I've heard it both ways, that maybe he did work another full 7 years, or that Rachel was given to him and then he just continued to work.
No, he had to work first.
Okay.
He had to work first.
So anyways, he eventually gets to marry both, and obviously his heart is for Rachel.
Yeah.
And not, I always get, is it Leah or Leah? Well, I'm asking her.
Well, everything is Leia.
Okay, we'll go with Leah then. Okay, so anyways, she is sad because obviously her husband doesn't want to be married to her. Again, more family drama, more marriage drama. But God seeing her and taking pity on her, because it doesn't seem like he has, taken a side in this per se, blesses her with children, and Rachel's unable to have children. And so this kind of goes back and forth. Rachel's mad. She can't have children. So back and forth, they pray. And then God finally gives Rachel a child. Oh, they also give their servants to bear children. It's quite the... I'm sure Jacob's not complaining in all of this.
No, the problem is portrayed as a guy who, when they start fighting, his wife start fighting. He was like, "Oh, I'm out of it."
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not here.
Yeah.
He's enjoying whatever is happening.
So, anyways, he gets a lot of kids. I believe 12 sons, as well as daughters that unfortunately are not mentioned by name. I don't think. Maybe a few of them are. But, anyways, he gets to the point where he realizes it's not going to work with his uncle Laban anymore. His uncle Laban's kind of been taking advantage of him, and he's just kind of tired of it. He's ready to go home. So he basically makes a deal. He's like, I'll take all the speckled and not as nice lambs as you and from your flock, and then you let me go. Laban's like, okay, yeah, whatever, you can do that. Well, Jacob, being his typical Jacob self, does this thing where he has them breed in front of these certain reeds or something, and so they all the best ones become speckled, all the weakest ones are the kind of pure coats. Well, then Laban, I don't remember if he kind of catches on, but he basically tells Jacob no, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So Jacob eventually flees from Laban. He says, okay, no, I'm gonna go, and he just leaves. He takes everybody and he leaves.
fun thing about that is just remember, God promised him that he would be this rich guy, you know, and everything. God promised him that he was this rich guy. But how does he get the richness? How does he
by
become
deception,
rich, you know? By deception, the same thing, you know. They wanted to build, you know, a rich they promised by their own, you know, own strength and knowledge.
So Laban basically pursues Jacob. They come to a treaty, a term of agreement. He's like, "You're stealing my daughters away." Something about idols. Rachel steals some idols from Laban's house and hides them. And he says, Jacob basically says, "I'll give," or does he even say, "I'll kill" whoever takes them?
Yeah, I think he promised to kill.
Yeah,
I think he promised to kill.
She lies about being on her period, so Laban doesn't. Bro, it's just unbelievably human, right? So then eventually they come to terms. Laban begrudgingly, I think, lets Jacob go, and he basically says, "Don't come back here. Don't come back here. I'll agree not to pursue you if you don't pursue me." So Jacob moves on from that problem, and he has a new problem. He has to go back to his brother Esau because he's going back home. This is where God told him he would bring him. And so he starts sending all these gifts. He sends everybody but himself to Esau, and he's alone, right? But I think this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yes.
Because God finally has Jacob to himself, right? He had him to himself when he was on the run to Laban, and now he has him by himself when he's going back home. And they wrestle, right? And, you know, with the angel of God, but it's this idea that Jacob will not let go until it's just Jacob to a core, right? But God touches him. It leaves him with a limp. But it says that you have wrestled with God. I want to find the verse if you can find it for me. But it's just this awesome story where Jacob walks away from the presence of God, never the same. And then it says, then Jacob prayed, O God of my grandfather Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you told me, return to your own land and your relatives, and you promised me I will treat you kindly. I'm not worthy of all the unfailing love and faithfulness you have shown me. When I left home and crossed the Jordan River, I owned nothing except a walking stick. Now my household fills 2 large camps. O Lord, please rescue me. This is kind of his prayer, right? Before he sends everything ahead. Says this, during the night he got up, and he was all left alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled him. Then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob. The man told him, from now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name. Jacob said, why do you want to know my name? Then the man blessed Jacob there, and he called that place Peniel, which means face of God, for he had seen the face of God, and yet his life was spared. So it's this idea that Jacob, all his wrestling and all his fighting and all his deceitfulness and trickery, he's wrestled with God, right? And he's not let go. And so God gives him a new identity going home. He's no longer Jacob, but he's this Israel, this person that God is going to fulfill his promises through. And so there's this idea of reconciliation, right? That things, even though he's not a good human being, God is going to bring this story to completion, and that Jacob eventually makes peace with his brother Esau. Things go well for him, and he settles in the land, right? And do you have any other final thoughts maybe on Jacob before we take a quick break?
No. I just love this guy's story, and just like, oh my God. Yeah, it's so human, you know.
Yeah.
It's so like, sometimes we read the Bible and just like, oh, these distant people, you know. But once we start looking at the story, how we are supposed to look at it, you know. We start realizing, oh my God, you know, we are like that even now, you know.
And it encourages us, because this is the God that walks alongside broken and flawed people. And I think what's even more important is God is determined to bring his promises about, even when people aren't always working alongside him well. So the story of Jacob, as the main character, really begins to wrap up here, and we transition into his family life. And this is really, up until this point, it's been the immediate family of Abraham. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But this is where the story after the break will begin to develop into a people that God wants to use. But before that, we'll explore the story of Joseph, which is Jacob's son, right after this quick break. Hey guys, this is Jake. If you are currently a university student on a campus in Botswana, we want to extend an invitation to you to get plugged into a discipleship group. So if you're interested, if that's something you want to do, if you want to begin to be a part of this family we call Kingdom Movement, we would encourage you to go into this episode's bio. There should be a link to our Instagram page. You can send us a message and we will make sure to connect you at a time and a place that works best for you and your schedule for school. But we don't want you to miss this opportunity to get plugged in and a part of what God is doing on the university campuses here, because we believe that you're a vital piece to what God wants to do to bring his kingdom, his wholeness, and his healing to the nation of Botswana and to the university specifically. So reach out to us today, guys, if that's something you're interested in. All right, thanks. All right, guys, we're back from the break, and where we left off was basically the end of Jacob's story. It's kind of the main character of the narrative, and now we get into Jacob's family. So the narrative kind of fast forwards. Jacob has 12 sons. The two youngest are both a man named Joseph and Benjamin, and I believe his love of his life, Rachel, dies in childbirth to Benjamin. So basically Joseph and Benjamin become kind of Jacob's babies. Like they're the special kids. Like he doesn't want anything to happen to them because they were born of this wife that he really, really cherished. And the other sons know that. They feel that kind of second-class citizenship.
And I just feel like even Joseph just takes his, like this pride, and then it just becomes, it just like show off, like I had this amazing dream, you guys will be, will bow to me and everything,
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think that's part of the narrative too, is like this idea of this naive young boy that, Joseph's hands are not perfectly clean in it. Yeah, like he's kind of the obnoxious younger brother that rubs it in your nose. Mm-hmm. But anyways, Jacob doesn't do him any favors. He gets him this special coat that distinguishes him as basically the favorite. So one day, Jacob's older sons, all his other sons, are basically out doing some work with their grazing flock. Of course, Joseph is at home enjoying the good life, but Jacob says he wants to send him out to them. I don't remember if it's a message or bring him lunch or whatever. But anyways, he sends Joseph out, and his brothers get this great idea of like, let's basically sell him off. Actually, I think originally they're just going to throw him in a pit and kill him. Yeah. But Reuben, the oldest brother, convinces them, no, let's not harm him. Like, he's, our brother. We can't do this. Mm-hmm. So they decide to sell him to some traders going to Egypt. They dip his nice coat in some like goat's blood to show their dad and say he got killed by a wild animal. So they sell this son, Joseph, off to Egypt. But yeah, before that he had some dreams. Basically, I believe they were stalks of wheat bowing down to him, and then stars that were bowing down to him. So they basically ship him off. Joseph is now a slave. No one knows who he is. Jacob thinks his favorite son's dead. He's heartbroken. And the older brothers kind of just continue on course. Obviously they probably have a little bit of guilt eating them up. Reuben feels awful because he didn't want any of this to happen. But so anyways, we get Joseph sent into Egypt, and he gets sold to this guy named Potiphar, right? So maybe you can explain the fun little story of Potiphar's house, right?
Oh yeah, so he has this wife and Jake and Joseph.
Yeah.
I was just
Joseph in Portuguese.
Jose.
So
yeah. So Joseph,
Paul is having lots of fun with these names.
Yes. So Joseph is just growing up, he just becomes this really strong and attractive guy, and then
lots of success too.
Yes, exactly. He's taking care of the house, and doing all these things, all these things that man, is supposed to do and everything, and probably spending more time at home than his wife, his
than Potiphar,
than Potiphar, because he goes out and take care of other things, So she just, kind of like wants to sleep with this guy, and then Joseph said, no, I'm not doing that, and then she just plot with, she just make lies like, hey, this guy really slept with me and everything.
Or tried to. I think she says that he tries to rape her, actually.
Exactly, tried to rape me, and all these things, and then so it just end up in this really bad situation where Joseph is just like, this guy, we really trusted, and then just like, oh man, I'll throw him to the jail. And then at the jail, he spent sometimes they, and I just feel like it just served to humble him a little bit, because he was like this kind of prideful guy, so it just served this time as to humble him a little bit. But then these two people who serves the king get arrested with him, and then they both have dreams, different dreams, and for some reason I don't remember where, but they end up sharing this with Joseph.
Yeah, so they get thrown in and they have these dreams, and Joseph is kind of known at this point somehow as a dream interpreter.
Oh, yeah.
So he interprets their dreams. One really bad, one really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then one end up dying.
Yeah.
The dream says he will die, and then the the dream says no, he will live. And then it end up happening. One dies, and then the guy who lives. But then he just forgets about this guy who helped him there. But though, even before he leaves the prison, Joseph say, "Hey, promise me that you will remember me, once you get to the king, So he forgets about Joseph, but God is faithful, God will make this guy remember. One day the king has a dream, and then he calls all these people to try to interpret the dream, but none of them can. They try to interpret it, but none of them say
He's not
something.
impressed.
Yes, exactly. None of them say something that makes him feel peaceful. That's like, no, it's not that, So and then this guy, just realized, oh yes, there's a guy who really interpreted my dream, and then really came through, and then the king say, call that guy here.
Yeah.
And then Joseph goes there, and then he interprets the dreams, And then for this guy, this king who didn't know God, and then he just finally meets God by this young guy.
And basically the dream was about a famine, 7 years of lots of plenty, but then the famine was going to be so severe that it would basically gobble up the years of famine. And so, because Joseph has this dream, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, puts him in charge of kind of like preparing for the famine, right? And so he gets elevated at this point to a really, really high position. The Bible says second in command.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note too, in the prison, Joseph was having success as well. So God was blessing him even in there, giving him kind of free reign. So anyways, the famine hits.
Mm-hmm. So the famine hits, and just everybody around Egypt is just going through, a hard time finding food and everything.
And sorry, I think it's important to note for those who are not geographically inclined, Canaan, the promised land, is really close to Egypt. Mm-hmm. So if you looked at a map of the Mediterranean and you know where Egypt is on the continent of Africa, that little strip that kind of connects Africa to Turkey, we'd call it like the transcontinental land bridge or something like that. So it brings those two continents together. That's where Canaan is. So they're down in the southern region there, close to Egypt. So that's how Egypt even gets brought into the story quite a bit.
Oh yeah. So so the people can't produce food because it's not raining and the land is not producing anything. So, but Egypt, they're having a party, they're having all this food, and then they start selling the food to these people, and then Joseph's family, with his brother and his father, all his family, they're going through the same thing, they can't find food and everything. So they hear about Egypt, like, oh, there's this amazing place, where there's food. So the father sends his son, he sends all of them, but he leaves Benjamin.
Yeah. He doesn't want Benjamin to go because
I don't trust
he's already lost Joseph.
Yes.
He's not losing Benjamin.
Yes.
And I think to expedite the story a little bit, there's kind of this back and forth. The brothers go, and Joseph recognizes it's his brothers. Mm-hmm. He kind of plays this game, and he says, "No, do you have another brother?" And they say yes. And he's like, "Well, he's got to stay here." They're terrified because they know their father's not going to say yes. And back and forth, he messes with them. You guys can read the story.
Yeah.
But eventually, it gets to the point where Benjamin goes and Jacob goes, and the whole family is brought back together in Egypt. But there is a really cool summary. You mentioned it, I think, earlier. Maybe you can read it for us. Because the whole point of this narrative is that, again, what human beings intended to do that was evil, right? They wanted to mistreat their brother. Yeah. God had given Joseph dreams that were legit, that they would bow down to him. And in fact, they did bow down to him as second in command of Egypt. They humbled themselves. And when Joseph eventually reveals himself as their brother, they recognize, and Joseph definitely recognizes, that all of this God has been using to bring about his purpose. And I think what's really interesting, I don't remember if it's Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, but God actually tells them, I believe it's Abraham, that they are going to go to a foreign land and be enslaved for 400 years, and then God was going to rescue them. So God already knew that all this was going to happen. And so this was kind of a part of what was going to happen in that narrative. Have you found it?
Yes, I found it, but I don't have my glasses.
Okay, great. It says, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so I think it's just, again, in the biblical narrative, when we read these stories, we always have to keep them within their context, right? To understand the meaning. But the meaning is also, it can be translated to our lives in the sense of Joseph could have look at his life and said, this is totally unfair. This sucks. I'm a slave. I was put in prison wrongly. This injustice has been done to me. But through all of that kind of broken relationship, broken family, God had done something miraculous. He saved the lives of probably hundreds of thousands of people by putting Joseph in a position. And at the end of the day, he is in a position really far greater than what he could have been if he was just living in Canaan.
Yeah, and I just feel like this passage, it just summarizes all, the stories of all these people we spoke about, they doing bad things, but that God, just like this puzzle maker, just like turning everything, to good, turning everything to the plan that he has, the man fell, the Adam and Eve, from the story of Adam and Eve, they falling, God kicking them out of the garden by not leaving them, going there with them, it's like, I like the fact that this is the last chapter of Genesis 50, so just the writer just places this, as a way to summarize everything that's been happening in the book. God turning every bad thing that human has been doing to good, and that's what God does even now.
Yes, and I think it's just an incredible testimony in the sense of like, God again wants to work through human beings. Could he have just provided food or whatever, or not made famine come or whatever? But God chooses in this dance of like working with and against people for his purposes to get accomplished. And I think it's always an invitation to join in what he is doing, if that makes sense. I think, so as we kind of fast forward, the story takes an extremely far fast forward, 400 years later, and it starts off with kind of this cryptic phrase that the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, who did not remember Joseph, right? And you can kind of feel like this dark cloud kind of move over the story. So here's this guy who basically sees the Israelite people. So, sorry, to give context, Joseph and his family are allotted land in Egypt. Jacob kind of, I think, is a little bit hesitant because he knows the promises are for Canaan, but they stay there, right? And over this 400 years, Jacob's family has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown until it's a massive amount of people. And the Bible tells us so much so that Pharaoh's afraid that they will threaten the Egyptian power structures, right? That at any moment, this mass population could flip the tables on them. And so he does what all good kind of dictator rulers do. He tries to oppress them to keep them down. So he creates this law that basically says all the firstborn boys of any Hebrew is meant to be killed. But and there's this really cool, and this is what I love about the biblical narrative, is a grand story, but there's little human stories of faithfulness plugged in. And so you get this story of these two midwives that are told to basically kill the babies when they come out. But these midwives refuse. They don't believe this is the thing to do. And so they fear God more than Pharaoh, and they spare the life of this child. Well, one of those children ends up being a boy named Moses, right? So they do a little trickery, and basically the mom, knowing that it was going to be impossible to hide him, puts him in the Nile River. He floats down to one of the daughters of Pharaoh. She sees this little Hebrew baby boy, and like any normal human being, once you see the actual baby, you're not up in your castle anymore giving these commands. You have a compassion, right? And so Moses' sister follows him down the river and convinces the princess to give him to his actual mom to be his nursing wet nurse, basically. So she raises him up to some point, and then he is trained up in kind of the Egyptian courts, and kind of given Egyptian identity and like knowledge and infrastructure, all these kind of things. So you can see how God has even set him up for leadership in the future by giving him this kind of formal education in the palace. But anyways, we're kind of expediting the story because we want to get to the main focus of the Exodus narrative. So then he's basically sees one day an Egyptian beating on some Hebrews. So a lot of them have become slave laborers now. That's another way that Pharaoh has tried to oppress them, to put them down so they won't flip the tables on Egypt. And he gets angry, right? Because he is a Hebrew. And so he strikes this Egyptian, kills him, buries him in the sand. And then the next day he sees two Hebrews fighting each other. And Hebrews are the name of the people at this point. And he's like, what are you guys doing? You're brothers. And they say, are you going to strike me down like you did that Egyptian? And now he recognizes the story spread. It's not just some hidden news. He needs to run. So he flees out into the Sinai wilderness. There he meets a man named Jethro, who he eventually marries one of Jethro's daughters. And he basically, for 40 years, a long, long time, just becomes a part of Jethro's family, a little shepherd boy, until a miraculous moment in the wilderness.
Yeah. Which is the burning bush.
Yes.
And that's the first time he meets God, right? Because he grew up without knowing about
in a personal way, yeah.
Yes, yeah. You might have heard about him. I don't feel like after all these 40 years, they kind of like were teaching, a little bit more of God,
Yeah, I think there was an idea or an identity as the people of this God, but at the same time, this God seems to be out. We're in slavery in Egypt. This God seems pretty far away.
And just one thing, like Pharaoh is portrayed as this really, really bad guy. And I just feel like that portrays will just kind of continue, till the point where he get destroyed, So he encounters God with this burning bush, and then God tells him, he sees this tree, burning, and then God tells him, hey, take off your sandals because this is a holy ground,
And he identifies himself because we have to remember, like, Moses grew up in a polytheistic system. Egypt had many, many gods, but he clarifies and he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And when Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. So there was an understanding, but never an encounter before, right?
Yeah, and this is the first time God says his name, because I just feel like when I get there, who will I say send me, and then God says, Ehe, which is like, I am sent you, But then Moses is in this situation, like, how can I say this name, It's like, he says I am, but I cannot say I am because I'm not God, and everything. So that's why he changed it, to instead of saying Ehe, and then he changes to Yahweh, So it's like he is, So that's why we have the first time we have the name Yahweh, which is continued.
Yeah, and this becomes the identifying marker. Up until this point in the story, God has never given himself this personal identification. Even to Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, it's always, I am the God of your father, right? But now it's Yahweh. And there's this idea too but God says to Moses, I have seen the suffering of my people. It is not gone unheard, and now is the time that I am acting. And I think for generations, even in during slavery, during the American period where slavery was allowed, a lot of the hymns for a lot of the slaves were based on this exodus, that God hears our suffering and he is not deaf. He will eventually act and move on our behalf. And so this idea of God hearing the suffering of his people is a narrative that will continue to carry on even up into the modern day, right? So that it becomes this catalyst in history where God says, I am about to act. I'm going to show this mighty power of the world, that who I am. I'm about to step onto the stage like I haven't yet. And he asked Moses, of all people, right, to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And Moses, I think, like most of us, are more realistic heroes. Like, no, not gonna do it.
It's not me.
No. And he comes up with a whole list of excuses.
Yeah.
He says, I can't speak well. I'm not bold. The people won't listen to me. I already have a bad rep with Egypt. But God says, I am sending you. You're gonna go.
Yes.
And he gives him some caveats too. He says, okay, you can bring Aaron with you. You know what I mean, to help you. But God says, you're the one I've chosen, right?
Yeah.
There's this great book called The Bush Always Burns by Heath Adamson. And basically the whole premise is there are holy moments to encounter this God named Yahweh everywhere if we would just turn and look aside. Because it says that Moses turned and saw the bush burning. And I thought it was a great idea because it doesn't tell us how long the bush was burning, but it was Moses who was willing to turn and look aside and enter into the presence of God. And so part of that calling is that Moses was willing to stop and see the presence of God and look. And so to kind of fast forward a little bit, Moses eventually agrees. There's this weird story where he hasn't circumcised his son, keeping with the promises. You wonder if a little bit of an Egyptian influence has rubbed off on him, but God's about to kill him. And his wife circumcises their son and touches Moses' feet with it or something. It's just, there's an idiom there, there's a cultural whatever. I've listened to it, I've completely forgot what that story is really all about, besides God being angry that he hasn't fulfilled his covenant as a people of God, or as a child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But anyways, after that gets done with, Moses goes to Egypt and he goes into Pharaoh's court and he basically walks up with a lot of cojones and he says, you're going to let God's people go. And Pharaoh obviously scoffs and he says, no, I'm not. And there's this battle. He puts his staff down and turns into a snake. Pharaoh's magicians do the same thing, but Moses' snake gobbles up theirs, right? And then go ahead.
Yeah, and I just feel like the story of Moses is kind of like, you have to read this story as this guy who's, at least for this first part, who is like kind of this human being who is so connected to God's purpose, who is so willing to do God's will, that the narrative, start kind of mixing him, with God's, like, and then sometimes God says this, but then sometimes God says this, but then it's Moses saying it, so just like, is it Moses, is it God, and everything, and I just feel like this brings this image, like what happened when God and human being come together and then they work, as this team, and then you get confused, you get this confusion, like, oh, is it God, is it the person, so I just feel like this story brings that idea of what happens when
that's a great point.
There's a connection between God and human being.
And up into the time of Jesus, Moses is kind of seen as the archetype of what a true Israelite or Jew should model after. He is the supreme kind of voice that people go back to or listen to, or authority in Jewish history. You know what I mean? And I think it's exactly what you're saying. But it's so interesting because the beginning of the story starts off with him saying no to God, right? But his character, his trust, his belief that this God can come through grows and grows and grows as the narrative continues, all the way up into, we're going to kind of fast forward through a lot of the plagues. I believe there's gnats, there's frogs, there's flies, there's hail and lightning, there's disease and pestilence, and people have argued were these basically a natural domino effect, like the animals died to the frogs, and so it doesn't matter because God moves mightily to rescue his people up into the point where it gets to the final one. Pharaoh has continued to refuse. He's reneged on his word when he said, yeah, I'll let you go, to the point where Moses approaches Pharaoh and he says to him, every firstborn in Egypt is going to die unless you let my people go. This is what God says. And God tells the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb. So they're meant to kill a lamb, use the blood to cover the doorposts, and the angel of death will pass over their house. Their firstborns will not die. So it becomes this kind of sacred moment, right, where the Israelite people kill the lamb, they cover the doorpost, they prepare, they get ready, they get everything ready to leave Egypt. Their rescue from slavery. This mighty God is going to finally act in one swift moment. He's going to death is going to pass over their house, and they will be rescued from slavery and leave Egypt. So that's exactly what happens. Pharaoh says, yes, finally, his son dies. He says, you can go, whatever, leave. We don't want you here anymore. I recognize I have no power over this God, right? So the Egyptians basically let the Israelites plunder them, right? That's a part of the promise that God gives Abraham all the way back in the original vision. And they begin to leave, right? And God says, I will lead you by a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. So God is literally manifesting his presence to lead his people out of Egypt. You can imagine, like, we believe as Christians, like, God is really manifesting himself in this way. Yeah. So what a dramatic, powerful, like, awe-inspiring moment this is for the Israelite people. They are recognizing that this God who is speaking through Moses really is rescuing us right now. He is different than all the other gods. And I believe each plague, sorry, I'm kind of rambling on, but each plague represented one of the deities, the main deities of Egypt. So God, in a way, is showing that he has power over not only the Egyptians, but the Egyptian gods, the gods that they trust in.
Yeah. And I just feel like the story of this story of the 10 plagues and everything is God's judgment coming to this really bad king. Yeah. This king who was really willing to kill babies, he was willing to just kill all these babies, who were born and everything, and these people. And I just feel like the last plague, it's kind of like any revenge, coming to what he did to God's people and everything. And I just feel like we have to read this story in that sense, understand how bad Pharaoh was, you know, and because there's this question, like, because the Bible says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and I was like, oh, is that fair and everything, But you have to remember, is this really, really bad guy, who really, if he's left alive, he's just continue to do all this bad thing. And also the Bible, if you read the Bible, I think it was on the 7th plague when God says, I will harden his heart. But before that, he is the one who hardened his own heart, So it's like he chooses to harden his heart, and then God's like, from now on, it's just like this guy is just, it got to really bad situation, and the only solution for him is death. And to get that, I will harden his heart.
And I think what's really important too is, we talked about this idea of, as the narrative continues, the idea of God's voice and Moses' voice gets kind of mixed, right? Where it seemed like they were separated. It's almost like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was very much a Pharaoh thing, but that also gets mixed in the narrative at some point, that God begins to say, in the sense of, the more we become one way or the other, whether it's obedient to God or not obedient to God, God either allows us to continue in disobedience or partners in our obedience. And I think that's something that's true even today, right? Yeah. So I think another interesting aspect to the Pharaoh side of things is during Joseph's day, during the famine, things got so impoverished that people began to sell off their land. So it actually consolidated up until the Joseph and the famine period. People had owned their own property, but Egypt had basically become monopolized by the government. And you can kind of see the results of it in this story, but that's an aside. So anyways, Israelites are being led by fire at night and this pillar of smoke or cloud by day, and they get to the point where they get to the Red Sea. Well, Pharaoh at this point's heart's hardened again. He's going to wipe these people out. He's going to force them to come back. And the people are terrified, right? They're like, what are we going to do? We can't stand up to Pharaoh. He has an army. And Moses looks at them and he goes, guys, God has provided up in this step. Watch, he is going to make a way. And so God miraculously parts the Red Sea. The Israelites pass through the waters, which is an important theme, even in baptism. They pass through the waters. They pass through this idea of death into life, slavery into promise, no hope into hope, right? There's all these themes that are happening. And the Exodus narrative becomes the story of the Israelite people, right? This is the defining mark that we are God's people. We look back to this story because God provided in such a way that we were marked out forever, right? This is when God really lays his permanent stamp on them. So anyways, they pass through the waters. God rescues them mightily. The waters crash down on the Egyptian army that is chasing after them. And basically, the Egypt side of the story
Yes.
ceases. They no longer pursue these people, and Moses and the Israelites are rescued. You know, they break out in an exuberant song. Miriam, I believe, Moses' sister, breaks out into a song of triumph that echoes what Mary, Jesus' mother, will sing later on. You can read that for yourselves. We won't go into it.
And
But
I just feel like this we have to see what you're saying. Just see the story, the idea of baptism. You know, has this idea of this crossing of the Red Sea. You know, because it's just when we get baptized, you know, you are born again. You know, has the people of God, the Israelites. You know, they were born again. Like they all the slavery life. You know, it's over. You know, they're no longer slaves. They are no longer going back to Egypt. You know, all these people who wanted to kill them and enslave them, they're dead. You know, it's the same idea with now. You know, when we go through water, you know, and we get baptized, all the old life, you know, all the slavery that we were to slave to the sin, you know, we're no longer that. We forget Egypt, you know, we leave Egypt behind, and then we start walking towards the promised land, you know, today, you know. So just, you know.
And I think, you know, we will definitely dive into this way, way, way more when we get to the New Testament. But I think it's good to just get readers thinking about this. Jesus chose his crucifixion, right, in the Last Supper during the Passover, which was an intentional message by him, right? And so Passover is this celebration of the Exodus story, of how God rescued and redeemed his people, brought them out of death and slavery into life and into promise. But just like the narrative up until this point, they get past the waters. Now they're in the wilderness, and they begin to grumble and complain. They even go so far as to say, have you brought us out, Moses, into the wilderness just to die, right? Has this God rescued us just to kill us? And Moses says he just gets so frustrated with these guys. God provides manna. He provides quail. He provides all that they need as they pass through this wilderness trial, right? This defining moment of like, are you going to be God's people? And, you know, it seems like it's already teetering on the edge. There's a kind of a moment where God tells Moses to break the rock and water comes out of it. And then God tells Moses to speak to the rock, but Moses decides to break it. And so back in my university days, my final semester, I actually got to take like a 3-week trip to Israel, to the Holy Land, and we went to the Sinai wilderness. And one of the really, really unique things about that is the location of where Moses is in those two stories. So when God tells him to break it, when God tells him to speak. This is where geography comes into play. That's so interesting. Where God tells Moses to break the rock there in that region is super solid. Like there would be no water inside of it. It's solid rock. But when the rock breaks, there is water. When God tells Moses to speak to the rock, it's actually this kind of hollow sandstone that actually is known for holding in water. And so God is trying to show his people through those two moments, it's me who's providing. It's not your natural territory. It's me who is providing what you need in the wilderness. But because Moses disobeys, basically goes through his own power, right? Again, the story of Abraham, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Jacob, trying to do things on their own. That's part of the reason why God later on in the story doesn't let Moses enter the promised land. Because that sin, that whatever you want to call it, that human condition that still slightly doesn't trust God in the moments, you know. Even Moses has seen God miraculously act. He trusts God to part the Red Seas, but in the water speaking to the rock, he acts in anger instead of obedience to God. But anyways, so they get to Mount Sinai, which is where God originally revealed himself to Moses, and this is the defining moment. This is the moment where God is going to put his stamp on his people, right? So basically, he calls up Moses up to the mountain. He gives him the 10 commandments. He also gives him other commandments to give to the people, but he basically tells them, prepare themselves, consecrate themselves, because they are about to encounter a holy God. And I think this idea of holiness is so interesting because in the garden, holiness still existed, right? But because of Adam and Eve's innocence, they didn't need all these procedures to come before a holy God because they themselves were already holy, right? They didn't need anything to make them holy. But because of this taint, because of this human condition, there is now a separation between a holy God and his people that has to be met before they can meet face to face again, right? And so God tells them to consecrate themselves, not to have sex, not to do all these other things, and not to go on the mountain, not even let an animal touch his mountain until he says so. So during all this, Moses is gone for a while, speaking with God. I just laugh because I'm like, bro, this story.
Oh, yeah.
So you want to say it?
So, yeah, maybe one thing I've learned this week, I think it was this week or last week, about this story, just like I know I'm getting a little bit ahead, but I just learned that it's better to start planting your foundation so because you get there and you have to go back to all of it, but the story of the mountain Sinai, and all the 10 commandments, it's just God starting to give them kind of like, this is the new life, this is the life that we'll be living, and this is how you guys are supposed to live from now on, and then you take that to the mountain sermon, it's Jesus Christ in this mountain, just like in the Sinai, just saying like, yes, this is the new way of life, this is how you guys is supposed to live. So it was just really cool to see these two parallels, and everything. Definitely. So it was cool to learn about
and
that.
Talking about the 10 Commandments,
exactly.
redefining them. But anyways, so we get to this point. The Israelites, basically, from my understanding, it's not that the Israelites wanted a new God at this point, but they needed, because of their cultural conditioning, they wanted a representation of who God was. Basically, this is where it gets so fascinating, is they don't recognize anymore that they are God's image. God is calling them to be his image in the world, but they want an image of God that they can worship. So they have Aaron put together this golden bowl, and Moses come down and you're like, guys, what are you doing, right? He's just ticked. He breaks the 10 Commandment stones. Aaron's like, well, they were getting upset. I don't know what I was supposed to do. And Moses is just shaking his head at this point. He rebukes the people. He destroys the bowl. And God, basically says, I'm going to abandon these people. They are already, I got them through the wilderness. I did this miraculous act in Exodus, and they're already unfaithful. And he's like, no, God, don't abandon them. These are your people, please. And again, we see that moment, like Abraham, over Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, okay, we're going to keep doing this. But you can already, you get the sense of like the human rescue plan. God is calling these people to be the people of his rescue mission. But already they're failing at this. So through the giving of the law, God literally calls them a priestly nation. So with this idea of priestly nation, this is super important, especially when we get into the New Testament. But understanding Israel's role. Clearly, Israel was not special or remarkable when it comes to people, whether it be talent or skill or even faithfulness to God. But God is calling them as a distinct people to be his representatives to the world, to be a blessing to the nations, which is a part of the promise God gives to Abraham. Your seed will be a blessing to the nations, not just to yourself, but you will be a blessing to all people, which is something we should have talked about earlier. But it comes to a culmination at this point. Now God is saying to the Israelites, you are meant to be a priestly nation. A priest was someone who represented people before God. So the priest would go into the temple as a holy, consecrated person to represent the rest of the people so basically being the representation of the people to God. So Israel is meant to be a nation that represents God on behalf of the other nations. Does that make sense? So we get to this place where God is calling them to be these people. So in order to be a priestly nation, they need to be holy. They need to be consecrated. They need to be distinguished from the rest of the nations. So God begins to give them laws about what they dress like, what they look like, what they eat, how they interact with each other. And it's distinctly meant to create a people that are distinct from the nations so that people can recognize that there's something different in them. And I think that's really important because we get kind of caught up, like, why did God say don't mix threads? Or why did God, and we kind of take that as like arguments today, like, oh, don't mix your clothing, like the material of your clothing, and that's right next to homosexuality. And we kind of like say, well, are they the same things? Well, clearly not. God is calling them to be a distinct people. And so for the Israelites, they were meant to have these distinct qualities, even the way that they looked.
Yeah, and even the way like with other people, God tells them, you have to love all these people, all these people from outside, you are really different, when someone comes, you have to receive them, and if they were willing to go through all this, you have to circumcise them and then receive them as a part of this big family, not just treat them as slave and not just treat them as really these people and everything. Even the slaves, you have to treat them, you have to give them freedom, the choice for them to choose if they want to be free or not.
The year of Jubilee, getting rid of debts. But I think in order to this is such a dense and important moment in the biblical narrative, because this is where really the story takes off as the Israelite people and the rest of the Bible. But I think to expedite the process, we just basically have to get this idea that God is creating a distinct people for himself to represent to the nations, right? But in order to be distinct, they have to be holy. Because the whole purpose is God's intention from the beginning was to dwell with people.
Yes.
So in the garden, he made a garden that he could dwell in with people. And so now it's a recreating of that garden in a distinct people. Just like the garden was a distinct place meant to go to the rest of the world, Israel is now a distinct people meant to share this hope with the rest of the world. And even the tabernacle, which will become the place that God dwells, travels with them, is in the middle of the camp, and all of the instructions, all of the artwork that decorates it is garden artwork. It's meant to call back to this Garden of Eden, that this is where God's presence will dwell. But in order to enter that presence now, whereas before we could enter freely, right, the Israelite people have to consecrate themselves. They have to do all these special things in order to basically sanitize themselves in order to enter into God's holy presence, right?
And one thing that I really like, I'd like to do is just, I think this will serve as a homework for our listener,
Great.
Just go ahead and read Exodus 25 and Genesis 2, and then read with this idea, I am looking in the Exodus 25, which is the description of the tabernacle, what are the things God is telling them to put in this place that you can find in the garden, and then you will find the idea of menorah, this big lamp, with all these things, coming, the light and everything. And then the menorah is kind of the representation of the tree of life, and everything. So just to all our listeners, just go read Exodus 25 and then Genesis 2, and then try to look in Exodus 25 the things in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And I think let's end on these kind of last two things, because I think we've gone quite a bit long. But the tabernacle now becomes where the Garden of Eden was a, let's say, heaven and earth place. So heaven is the realm and reality in which God dwells, right? It is the space that he operates from. I think we have to get that clear when we talk about heaven. Just like Jacob and the ladder, it was like a curtain was revealed, right? Where he saw the heavenly reality going on in his earthly space. So the tabernacle becomes this distinct place, an overlapping place, where the presence and the rule and reign of God can dwell in the earthly reality, right? So when the Israelites walked into the tabernacle, it wasn't like they just thought they were walking into a tent. They really truly believed it was a space where God's reality, God's presence would fill their reality, if that makes sense. So the tabernacle becomes this moving space among God's people where his presence and their presence can meet, right? And I think that becomes really, really important when we look at the person of Jesus. And we'll get into that, but even John says that when Jesus came into the world, he pitched his tent of flesh among us. And that's a callback to the tabernacle, right? This heaven and earth reality that is overlapping. So, go ahead.
Yeah, and something funny, I don't know if I'm cutting you off, but something funny is you look you read the story. I think it's in Leviticus, and then after they will have this amazing guy in Exodus. I think at the end of Exodus, he has these big great skills, to build everything that is needed, and then they start placing it, and then God tells them to consecrate, the tabernacle in these 7 days, 7 days, 7 speeches and everything, 6 speeches, and then in the 7th days there's the rest, So you have this idea of recreation, coming and happening, in this small place, in this portable, place, and the story of the recreation. And then what happened right after that? We have these people who are supposed to get in there, and being holy and everything. They just are drunk, and then they go in there, just exactly with Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
Oh.
And so you see these themes. Like, the Bible is one narrative story. I mean, that's the whole reason why we're doing this story, this biblical story series, because we want our listeners to see, like, this is a narrative thread that runs throughout the whole thing. It's not separated stories.
Yes.
It's just not random ideas or like moral tales or fables that people should listen to and reflect. There is that a part of the story, but the reality is that the Garden of Eden, the creative God, intends to dwell with his people. How is that going to happen? And so to really fast forward the rest of kind of the story leading up into Judges and the book of Joshua, they finally get to the promised land. They sent spies out. People were afraid to get into the promised land. They didn't trust God to provide for them. So he makes that generation die off in the wilderness for 40 years. But Abraham finally gets to look at the promised land. But there's kind of this I keep saying Abraham. What I mean is Moses. Yeah. Moses looks into the promised land, but he can't enter in, right?
Yeah.
And so the leadership is handed off to a man named Joshua, who is kind of like Moses' right-hand man through this whole process. And so Joshua is left with the task of entering the promised land, right? To taking this land for the people of God that has been promised to them.
Yeah.
But the story kind of leaves this kind of nuanced ambiguity of like, is this hope fulfilled, or is this a fragile future kind of teetering on the edge, right? Because the people have already gone back and forth. And will they trust God to help them conquer this land and make it their own as promised, or will they try and take matters into their own hands again? And so this is where the story leaves off, and where we'll leave off for this episode before the Israelites enter the promised land. Any final thoughts, Paulo?
No, I really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I just feel like I hope it's as helpful for the listener, as it's been, for me right now. You're bringing new way of looking at the things, and I think we'll put this as a link in the
bio.
In the bio of this episode. But it's just this image, I said this. I was talking to someone in my church. I was like, if you read something in the Bible that you can't connect, in the New Testament that you can't connect to the Old Testament, then maybe you're adding something, So there's this really image that I really like of these.
It's like a trillion threads connecting the Old Testament to the New.
Just so like how everything is all connected. So it's a really cool image that we will put in the bios. But I just feel like this has been a really great conversation, and I enjoyed it so much.
Definitely. All right, guys, we'll wrap it up just because we know this one has run a bit long, but the Exodus narrative is a really, really important one to keep in mind as we go forward. But until next time.
Yes, till next time.
Bye. Hey, everyone. This is just a brief reminder that if you've had a question come up from this discussion, or you just have a question in general that you want to ask us on the podcast, now is the time to do it. We want to make sure that we get these questions in for the end of the season Q&R. And we cannot wait to hear your guys' questions, to read them, and to be able to respond. But we can't do that unless you send them to us. So make sure, if you're a part of Kingdom Movement already, you can personally message us your question, or you can send them via our Instagram, and we will make sure to read those, and hopefully we will answer your question on the season finale question and answer, question and response episode. All right, thanks, guys.